Hello and good afternoon. This lecture is being recorded on the weekend, but it will be posted for Wednesday. I'm not sure what the date is. Let me check. This lecture will be posted on the 7th, and this is part one of two lectures you have to watch. As I said, I'm just going to split them in half to make it easier for you to take a break. It also helps to kind of divide what I'm talking about into kind of themes or topics. So good afternoon, if that's when you're watching it, or good evening, whatever. This is the textbook that I did post pictures of it for you to look at, so you can order it by as soon as possible because of Chuseok delivery. As I said in class on Friday, if you were not there, we have a holiday, so next Friday there's no class. We'll have to make up that class somehow. We'll decide how to do that or when to do that. But the 16th is the next class on Friday, and that's always going to be in class unless I otherwise notify you. Somebody asked me at the end of class when the first quiz is going to be, and to be fair, I normally would have done it on the 14th, but since we missed a class, the 21st, Wednesday, September 21st, is going to be the first quiz, okay? And of course, the material on the quiz will be from the lectures during the next 2 weeks, okay? So Wednesday the 21st at 12 o'clock noon will be your first quiz. Now, I already did the orientation and we started talking in general about culture, and I was comparing. I wasn't getting into British culture that much yet because I was comparing, German culture and Korean culture and international culture. I know there's lots of students from different places. I saw some students from Bangladesh that I talked to after class. So lots of people from different countries probably represented. There's somebody from France, there's somebody from Vietnam. So I'll try to be as inclusive as possible, but as usual, the majority of the class is Korean, and it's always good for international students to also get a little bit of exposure to Korean culture in English, maybe even from me, because I've lived here for 15 years and I love Korea. That's why I'm still here, and I do like my job, and I've made my own observations about Korean culture. So I will sometimes make comparisons between certain people or events or time periods, just to help anchor what I'm talking about in a way that helps you compare it, right? To grasp it. It's always helpful when you're examining another culture that's not your own, to sort of say, oh, well, that's somewhat similar to something that I'm familiar with, that I've already learned, whether it's a historical thing, economic thing, or maybe it's a person who had a certain effect on the development of your own culture. So we will be doing that periodically, but I will be focusing on the details of British culture itself. Before I do that, though, I do want to re-emphasize what we said in class. What exactly is culture? Well, it's a very difficult thing to define because, as one student said, it's everything, okay? But the core aspects of culture that we focus on are important, which you can say everything, all of our experience, everything that we see and hear, the things that we wear and things that we make are part of human culture, right? So the way that a group of people does those things is the limits of a culture. One student also said culture is very diverse, which is true, but if you want to attempt to look at a group, you have to look at common things within that group as well. So what shared experiences would a British person have, or somebody who is within the field of British culture? What shared experiences do they have? Life obviously is an essential part of a culture. If you don't have human beings that are alive who have values, certain values, and form groups like You can say you have a culture if you have a hunter-gatherer society, but that's a very individualistic, spread out society where there's less culture, right? We tend to think that there's more culture, the more people that are concentrated, we think that's more culture, right? But where is the cultural center of United Kingdom? Everyone's going to say London, right? Everyone, because it's the biggest city, it's a historical city. It's got all of it's central in every way. Population, it's closer to the continent. There's better jobs, there's more entertainment, there's more buildings, there's more education. These are the measurements we use to say, well, something has more or less culture. But that, of course, that doesn't mean that if you live in Newcastle or you live in Yorkshire, right? Or you live in the Midlands, if you may not know what I'm talking about. And the reason you don't know that I'm talking about it, because it's not as famous. We don't consider those cultures the most important, significant, representative cultures of England, but they are places that have their own cultures. But as we said in the first lecture last Friday, they are not the dominant culture that we feel represents British, right? When you think of British stuff, you think of, like, if you look in the textbook, when you get it here, I have a picture of Stonehenge there, and then I have a collage on page 21. Right after there's, a picture of like a Neolithic hammer, made of wood and stone. Right underneath that on page 21, there's just a collage of British symbols. And if you look at the symbols, it's kind of cartoony. They're icons, they're graphics from the internet. But you got umbrellas, which is pretty much a universal thing because of British weather. But if you look at there's certain buildings there. There's the Elizabeth Tower with Big Ben in it. There's St. Paul's Cathedral. There's the Queen's Crown, several crowns representing the crown jewels. There's a double-decker bus, and there's London Bridge. Certain things there are in London, and they're nowhere else, right? So, in that collage, some of those things, the Union Jack and stuff, that's not location specific, but some of those pictures, if you look at them, it's London. London is the quintessential representation of Britishness, right? And part of the reason is because the British is a multicultural idea. As somebody pointed out, there are different regions, distinct former countries who have joined together to form a union, which is what British is. It's not a monocultural country. To be fair, though, once you get to know Korea better as well, Korea isn't either, right? There are distinct regions, and a long time ago, Korea was separated into 3 kingdoms, and largely there are still inherited characteristics and sometimes tensions between those regions. There's the southwest of Korea, Honam was a Paekje kingdom, and the Shilla kingdom was Gyeongsang, and Gyeonggi-do and Seoul, Gangwon-do and North Korea were Goryeo. So there was 3 kingdoms, and now there's 2. Now we have North Korea and South Korea, right? And there was 3. So there are still, these regional, but they're not as distinct, and they didn't retain as much of their independence from each other the way that the United Kingdom did, right? So it's not called United Korean Kingdoms, it's just called Korea. So to a certain extent, Koreans have assimilated more. But basically, if you've lived in Korea even for a little while, there's Seoul and there's everybody else, right? London and England is not like that. London is not half the country's population. Sometimes it feels like it's representative of half of England, but it's not. A population of 10 million out of 60 million is not 22 million out of 50. So there are obviously significant differences, but London has sort of an outsized importance in representing British culture. Okay, so you got all these factors that kind of feed into your idea of what a culture is, right? Beliefs, someone mentioned religion. Obviously, communication involves language. Language is very important to the identity of a culture. That's why, people try to protect their language, because if they feel that they don't have their own language, then they've lost their identity, right? Because this is key. Culture is pervasive and flexible, but identity, although identity is flexible as well, we try. It's a kind of, it's human nature to try and get some sort of fixed identity. You want to anchor yourself. We're always doing this. Like, what nationality are you, right? What gender are you? What ethnicity are you? Who are you, right? Are you defined by your job? Are you defined by your appearance? Are you defined by your ancestors, right? All of these things play into our identity. So for this class also, identity is going to be very important. Like, what does it mean to be British? What is a British identity, right? And later, of course, what is an American identity? And it is problematic because these definitions of what it means to be American or be British, first of all, they change, right? But also, increasingly in our society, we're mixing more and more. We always did. We always had flow of populations and ideas and ways of doing things, but globalization has made it so that the whole world is constantly exchanging. It's really hard. It's not really hard. It's just it's clearer that there's less of a difference between somebody who lives, in the European Union is a great example. The differences between smaller areas are starting to, in some ways, they're starting to break down, and in some cases, people are against that, right? And sometimes that gets expressed in resistance to different cultural practices. Sometimes it expresses itself in racism or, conservative, ideas that people are against change. They want things to stay the same. Famously, Donald Trump said, "Make America great again." And what he meant by that was, make it like it was before, right? He's appealing to Americans who thought that America is getting worse and we need to make it like it was in the 1980s or like it was in the 1960s. He's trying to roll back the clock. He's canceling all of these things. And there's a lot of resistance to immigration and stuff like that. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Americans, especially, but British, any country, but Americans in particular, even though they're a nation of immigrants, tend to lean towards this nativism where they become afraid that the American identity is disappearing, right? It's not disappearing, it's constantly changing. But if you can't have it stay the same, but they would like it to stay as much as possible the way it was. And you have that same idea. I think it's not as strong in British culture now as it used to be, but Brexit is a great example of just the unwillingness to accept, participation in a larger culture. That there's in some sense, they're afraid that they're losing control of their own country, and that sharing the power and the free exchange of economic and population flow is going to somehow break down a traditional idea of what the United Kingdom is, okay? The European students already know all this stuff probably, but I think it's helpful for Korean students to understand that. And the same thing happens in Korea. Korea has a very low birth rate. We need to have more children being born in Korea, and if we don't, you need immigration. But Koreans are very hesitant to have large numbers of people immigrate because they feel that might change Korea, and they would lose maybe Korean language or Korean customs, or having large amounts of foreigners would transform Korea in a way that would make them uncomfortable or undesirable. That there's always that kind of what can I say? It's not really a fear, anxiety in general, and you do have to realize that that's going to happen. And what kind of vision of the future are we looking at? Are we trying to have distinct nations forever in the future? Like, do we need to have like certain countries with certain borders, or is the future keeping aspects of cultures that came from certain regions and preserving them, but allowing everybody to exchange them? So we end up having like a dominant global culture instead of dominant national cultures. This is just my perspective, but it's something to think about, right? So as we go through and I focus on things that are essentially British or essentially American, remember that my personal perspective is that you don't have to, it's good to know all these things, but that we don't really need a royal family in the United Kingdom for British culture to continue. Somebody suggested that we should get rid of them. I won't say who it was, but that's a common, they're very popular. The British royal family is very popular, but there's a large portion of the population that doesn't see the point of holding on to an ancient institution that really doesn't have a function anymore. It's really just a symbol of British culture. But we are going to talk about symbols, and the entire history of the British culture is very closely tied to the kings and queens that were in power. So there is going to be a lot of discussion and information and description of kings and queens in this course, because not only is it important to understand how things developed and what roles kings and queens had and why they don't have that role anymore, and why we probably don't want to have, a kingdom anymore, why we think our society now has improved and moved away from having a monarchy. But it's also, it's a great story. It's fascinating material. Any of you who have watched Game of Thrones and love Game of Thrones, because that was an incredibly famous and popular HBO series, if you read the books, which you probably didn't because they're 1,000 pages each, those books were all about a fantasy medieval scenario where people were competing to be the king of Westeros, and all of that story was based on English Civil War in the 15th century, something we call the War of the Roses. Much of what those books were based on is the violence and the political intrigue and the politics and everything is actually based on some real historical events. So we're going to talk about that. Why do we love these stories so much? Because they are interesting stories. It's a human experience, right? And the other thing is, when I'm talking about stuff from a long time ago, I think one of the best things about this course is to just try and imagine what it was like. Okay? We're living now, you're a certain age, and you're young, so you haven't experienced a lot. You didn't live 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but as you get older, your culture is going to change, and British culture and American culture are going to change too, obviously. The whole world is going to evolve. And if you look through the past and you're able to look at what's happening in each period and understand it better, this is a very helpful thing for you, right? To know that we're in the middle of the coronavirus. This has never happened in the world before this way, right? We've never had technology. We've never had airplanes and vaccines that can be produced in less than a year. And we haven't had, tracing and tracking. and social distancing and mask mandates and all this kind of stuff. We've never had this, but we have had pandemics all the time. It's only in recent history, basically since, penicillin and modern medicine started to be developed and spread across the world, that we didn't constantly have to deal with plagues and pandemics and viruses and measles and smallpox and polio and people dying and people being horribly disfigured and people being, their bodies being damaged and their health being ruined, even if they survived, living a sort of, I don't want to say damaged, like they've been injured, they've been infected, and even though they didn't die, they have to live with the consequences of a disease for their entire life. My personal favorite American president is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, many young people don't know that he had polio when he was younger, so he was in a wheelchair. And when you see him speak and you see him in front of a podium or you see him in public, they always made an effort to disguise the fact that he was in a wheelchair, that the media played down the fact that he was a cripple. But one of the best presidents in history couldn't walk, right? And that was because of a serious disease. We don't have to deal with that anymore. Or at least we haven't had to deal with it until a few years ago. And when the pandemic happened, it's important to realize that it's not unprecedented. It's just how do we deal with the fact that pandemics are going to happen? And they have happened in the past. So how do we minimize it, or how do we deal with it now? Shakespeare had to deal with plagues. And when they had a plague, they just shut down everything, and anybody who could leave London just went into the countryside until the plague burned out and killed a lot of people. And then the next year they would come back and open up the theater and open up the shops and the markets and continue on. That was what they did. They just let the plague run its course. So all of these things, I think, make this course very relevant, that once you learn about all of these, you learn about these figures, the environments, the artifacts, the circumstances. I've simplified it to people, places, things, and events. These mean the same thing. Once you study these things and once you learn about them, you can see there's that human life, as much as it's evolving, just like my textbook, the title of my textbook, as much as culture is evolving, and at certain points we have big events called revolutions, as much as that is happening all the time, there are things that are common human experiences. If they weren't, then we would never be able to understand our ancestors. If I took all of you and we went back in time 2,000 years, and we were a bunch of Celtic people, living in tribes in England, and we saw the Roman legions landing their ships, starting to land their ships, and they had elephants, believe it or not. They had siege engines, and they had steel armor, and they had thousands of legionnaires, and they had siege trains and baggage trains, and they had centurions, and they had commanders. Imagine you put yourself into that position. What would be your reaction? What would your life be like? Being able to put yourself into that situation is helpful to help you understand what's going on in the world today, what happened in the world before, and to create some, human understanding between all of us to make us better citizens. So when I mention something off topic, like what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, or what's happening in China, or what's happening in Syria, or what's happening wherever it's happening in the world where these circumstances occur, when you look at other situations and you have the ability to imagine what it would be like into that situation, it also helps you appreciate, right? How good we have it, to be studying in a university and to be safe and just to think about the ideas and the consequences and the relationship between human beings and what culture means, and not to actually have to live through those events, those revolutions, those serious big events, wars and revolutions that change the course of human history, right? It's when you study it, hopefully you get a better sense of how good your life, maybe you feel like your life is hard, but I like to think compared to what our ancestors dealt with, we are the most privileged generation ever, right? In terms of health, in education, in safety, we are the luckiest, we are the most developed and generation ever for whatever country you came from. If you're in my class in Cheongnam taking this class every week, then you're one of those people. You're one of the people that are privileged. So we do need to examine what it was really like for human beings and what things were important to cultures in the past, right? Disease now is important to us in a way that it wasn't 5 years ago. But for the rest of human history, disease was a daily danger, that you could die from a disease anytime, right? If you were a farmer and you cut your finger and the finger got infected and there was a bacteria that got into your body, that could kill you, right? Nobody thinks when they cut their finger that they're gonna, get a serious infection and then 1 week later they're gonna be dead, especially if they're, a 25-year-old person who's healthy and working on a farm. But that kind of stuff happened before. It doesn't happen anymore. So the reality, we have to think about the moment as well, right? You have to think about all of these things, and that you have to put those things, as I said, yes, on Friday, that is yesterday, but last week when you see this video, as I said, context, right? Context, whenever you talk about something, whether it's contemporary, that the person is alive, or the event is recent, or the environment is around you, that you can see it, consider the context. It's essential. Context is everything, really. If you don't have that, really you can't discuss culture effectively. Okay? Now, one more thing before I close this first part of our week one lecture, week one Wednesday lecture. As I said, this is not a history course, although things are organized in like a traditional historical way. So we're going to start at the beginning, We're going to start at the beginning of what, British people call the beginning, which is when people first migrated to the British Isles. They first went from the European continent about 10,000 years ago. People moved and they lived. That's where we're going to start. And we're just going to talk about a few significant things about that, first 10,000 years of human beings occupying that land. And then the most significant event, first really significant event, human-wise, is that Roman invasion I just alluded to. Is that this is the first big event that British people can trace their recorded history to, is when the Romans conquered the southern part of what they called Albion, but essentially what would later become the Kingdom of England, okay? Now, as we go through, like when these things happen, historians tend to have various opinions about why things happen and how they develop. Just a very simple historical perspective is that it's leadership, it's individuals, it's the personality and the intelligence and the decisions of certain people, key people, that change the course of history, right? You got your Napoleon, you got your Julius Caesar, right? You got your Yi Sun Shin, For Koreans. Germans, I don't know, Frederick the Great. No, I already said Napoleon for the French people. I'm not familiar too much with Vietnamese history, but obviously Ho Chi Minh, important figure. Chinese people, there's many choices about all these very important emperors, Mao Zedong, all these people, right? It doesn't matter who you choose. Julius Caesar, all of these people, Winston Churchill, George Washington. Would history be different if they had died, or they had never been promoted, or they had never been given the opportunity, right? Some people believe that that's key to the evolution of not just culture, but just the course of history for the entire world, right? I think it's hard to argue that if Napoleon had been shot in the early revolution and never had a chance to become emperor and take over Europe and attack Russia and have the Battle of Waterloo, I think it's impossible to deny that another person would be able to do that. But some people believe that if there wasn't a Napoleon, there would have been somebody else that was Napoleon-esque. Maybe not done as much as Napoleon did or done it the same way, but it's inevitable that France, revolutionary France, was on a certain path, and certain individuals, had bigger or smaller roles. But if you substituted people in, or people died or lived, and things had happened a different way, then that would not matter, right? So when you say, okay, what if Napoleon died? And imagine what would happen differently. That's called a counterfactual, right? It's not something that happened. So all you can do is imagine what would have happened. But we're not doing that stuff because actually that's very time consuming, and it's very speculative. So you can't. There's no way of proving that, and I don't want to go there. So we're gonna focus mostly on both, rather than saying versus. I'm going to talk about kings and queens and leaders and presidents and generals and scientists and writers and so on, because they did have an impact, right? Even if they weren't leaders who commanded people to do something, people who wrote great, who created art or music, or well, it's all art. You know what I mean? Sculptures, paintings. Music, composed music, wrote poetry, novels. What they wrote and the ideas that they expressed, they affected sometimes millions of people. And I mentioned Shakespeare, and our German students said, "Oh yeah, Germans love Shakespeare," and I studied Shakespeare. Like, how can you measure the impact of a person 400 years ago who is studied and consumed and adapted and imitated all over the world in 100 different languages? That's a great man, right? And when I say great man, I'm only saying that because that's what they used to say. And I'm gonna correct it because obviously it should be great person. In the past, women had less opportunities to be that great person, but I'll do my best to give you examples because there are, of course, great British women. My favorite being Queen Elizabeth I. But there are other queens. There's Queen Anne, and there's Bloody Mary, and there's Queen Boudica, and there are fantastic writers: Mary Shelley, Jane Austen, Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and so on. But I can't talk about everybody, so I won't. I will choose certain representative figures, events, environments, and artifacts. And if you are enjoying them and you're interested in them, that's great. But remember, as I said, it's not, this is a very short list. It's by no means complete. Hopefully the things that I tell you are interesting and you want to know more, and you can find out more on your own. We talked about this, that you have unlimited information at your fingertips. So once you get a general sense and you get some samples of British and American culture, I hope you continue to study and learn more about it yourself. One more thing for this part of the lecture before I stop for today. This is just an example of one way of looking at history. One of the most important innovations in studying history is, of course, Karl Marx. And I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking about communism and his ideas about the proletariat, but just I'm talking more about his perspective on history, that it's not about individuals at all. His idea about trends and forces is that society has ideas and social institutions develop, right? Society develops according to basically the structure of material economy. So everything in history and society, that what drives history and changes culture is actually economic conditions, which means that you don't need to focus on Napoleon or King Richard the Lionheart or Henry VIII or Winston Churchill or George Washington. What you need to focus on is the economic relationships between peoples, and that is what drives cultural change and gives you the tools in order to analyze how history develops. This is not on the test. In fact, this is all of what I've talked about so far is really to explain to you what the value of the course is, why we're studying it, and how we're going to study it. And from part 2 of this lecture, the material that you need to, I don't want to say memorize, but be familiar with so that you can answer questions when I test you, that is going to start in part 2, okay? So don't ignore what I just said, because it's relevant to everything in the course, right? But I'm not going to ask you what are the 4 things that I'm going to use as examples. That's not going to be a question. The questions are going to all relate to British culture. The exception to that, though, is the pages that I told you to look at, right? The pages I told you to look at in the introduction, from page 38, right? To give you a reminder, 38 to 42. 38 to 42, there's that cultural dynamics perspective, right? Method of analyzing. And then there's the contexts, right? Cultural studies context. You do need to know that, because I will ask you to explain that or to answer a multiple choice question. And as I said on the assignment, the first assignment, that is the way that I want you to analyze your chosen representation of British culture. Okay? All right. I was trying to keep it to 30 minutes, but I'm not very good at keeping on time when I'm recording. So we'll cut it off here. Please watch this video first, and then part 2 will be uploaded shortly after. Thank you for listening, and have a very happy holiday. Enjoy yourself, and come back refreshed, ready to learn more about British and American culture. Okay?